Today we ask, why did President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni go into the bush to fight a democratically elected administration? Hi, this is Wamba TV. Today we are back again with our election updates in the Republic of Uganda as we head into 2026 for the general parliamentary and presidential elections that are happening on the 15th of January 2026. Before we go into the answer to that question, we shall give you a very brief background about what has been happening in Uganda since independence. When Uganda got independence in 1962, Sir Edward Mutesa was the first black president of the Republic of Uganda. At that time, Dr. Milton Obote was the prime minister. In 1966, Dr. Milton Obote, the then prime minister, toppled Sir Edward Mutesa and sent him into exile, where he later died from in 1968. Later, when Dr. Milton Obote took over the leadership of the country, in 1971, Idi Amin Dada toppled him too in a coup d'etat that happened in that very same year. Idi Amin Dada was the president of the Republic of Uganda until 1979. Now, all this that was happening in this country was a manifestation of unrests since the whites left this country in 1962. So, for that effect, a military commission was formed, and that military commission had the responsibility of organizing elections in the country for the very first time, and this was in 1979. In 1979, the election roadmap was laid down. This election was meant to happen in 1980. Now, we have to remember that Dr. Milton Obote had been the president before Idi Amin had toppled him in a coup d'etat. He had a party called the Uganda People's Congress. Milton Obote expressed interest to run in the presidential race that was meant to happen in the year 1980. So these are the political parties that expressed interest to run in the presidential election of 1980. This was the Uganda People's Congress, which was led by Dr. Milton Obote, who had been a president before and also a former prime minister in the administration of Sir Edward Mutesa. At this time, Sir Edward Mutesa had already died in 1968. So, Dr. Milton Obote expressed interest to run for the presidency. Another political party was the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party at that time was led by Mr. Paul Semogerere, who also expressed interest to run for the presidency at that time. The other political party was the Conservative Party and also the Uganda Patriotic Movement, which was led by Yoweri Kaguta Museveni at that time. So there were only 4 political parties that expressed interest to run in the 1980 presidential elections. And the number of registered voters in that year were 4,898,117 registered voters at that time, and only 4,174,380 people turned up for the vote. In other words, that was 85.22% voter turnout. Actually, in the history of Uganda, that was the election that saw the biggest voter turnout up to this day. Now, the Presidential Elections Act in Uganda at the moment is very clear. In fact, the Presidential Elections Act of Uganda is very similar to the presidential elections acts of very many other countries. About the declaration of the winner for the presidency, the person who has won over 50% of the vote is the one who is declared the winner for that presidential race. But this was not the case in 1980. In 1980, there were two things. One was the popular vote, the person who gets the most number of votes. But there was another thing, the person who gets the most number of members of parliament. So these were the results in the election that happened in 1980 in Uganda. Out of the 4,174,308 voters who turned out for the election, Milton Obote and the Uganda People's Congress Party polled 1,963,679, which is 47.07% of the total vote cast. Then the Democratic Party candidate, Paul Semogerere, polled 1,966,244 votes, which is 47.13%. And Yoweri Kaguta Museveni of the Uganda Patriotic Movement polled 171,785 votes, which was 4.12%. In other words, in this presidential race, President Museveni was the third. Now, when we look at the popular vote, Paul Semogerere, who had polled 47.13%, had won the popular vote against Milton Obote, who had polled 47.07%. So, under the popular vote, Paul Semogerere of the Democratic Party won this race. But this was not enough. Like I said, the Presidential Elections Act at that time required a sitting president to be having more number of MPs in parliament. So in that election, the UPC won 75 seats in the National Assembly, and the DP won 50 seats in the National Assembly, and the UPM won just one seat in the National Assembly. So even when DP had won the majority vote with 47.13%, it did not get the opportunity of occupying State House because it had less members of parliament in the National Assembly. So under this law, Milton Obote won the presidential race, even though he had less votes cast for him. But now this takes us to the question we started with. How on earth did Yoweri Kaguta Museveni get into this picture? Yes, how did Yoweri Kaguta Museveni get into the picture? Because when we look at these results, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni polled only 4.12% of the total vote, 171,000 votes out of the over 4 million votes cast. Also, he got only one member of parliament at that time, and that was Dr. Crispus Kionga, who was the only member of the National Assembly on the UPM ticket. Crispus Kionga comes from Kasese. Like you said earlier, when Dr. Apollo Milton Obote took over power on the 17th of December 1980. So it is assumed that Yoweri Kaguta Museveni immediately started making plans of going to the bush to fight this democratically elected government at that time. I have to remind you that the NRA war started on the 6th of February 1981. Now, between 17th December 1980 and 6th of February 1981, it's just a difference of less than 8 weeks. How on earth would somebody make a risk that big in such a short time? It is evident that President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni didn't start planning this thing immediately after the election. It is evident that he came into this election well knowing that one, he's not going to win. Two, that Dr. Milton Obote and the UPC will rig this election. He did not come to this election just to win, because he was sure he did not have a ground big enough for him to win. He only came into this election to find legitimacy for what he was going to do later on, because it is evident that he could not have planned all this thing in just less than 2 months. The reasons that Yoweri Kaguta Museveni gave before he went to the bush and even when he was there were majorly two. One was Dr. Milton Obote and the UPC rigged the elections. Two, that there had been mass killings and abductions of political opponents at that time by the UPC government. And somebody would ask, for a government that had been in power for not less than 2 months, how on earth would it have committed such offenses in just a very short time? But you have to remember that Dr. Milton Obote had been a president before in 1966. So, whatever crimes Yoweri Kaguta Museveni accused Milton Obote were not necessarily the crimes that he had committed in the second episode of his presidency. It is assumed that President Museveni accused Milton Obote for the crimes he had committed in his first episode when he exiled Sir Edward Mutesa and made him die in 1968 in exile. The takeaway here is President Museveni did not go to the bush because he had lost an election, because in the first place he was very sure that he wasn't going to win after all. He went into the election to use it as an opportunity to express his dissatisfaction with the Milton Obote and his administration, and also make his bush war a legitimate one. Just like we said, we have a duty of giving you all the election updates in Uganda each and every single day. There is only one thing you can support us by sharing this video with others and also subscribing to this channel, because that's the way this message can reach even more people. Thank you, and thank you so much.